Hello and welcome. My name is Kate Marion. I'm a program manager for the Department of Small and Local Business Development. And today we are very happy to have this session by the DC Bar Pro Bono Center and Start Small, Think Big. Today's session is What If? A Practical Guide to Commercial Lease Problems During COVID-19. We know this is an incredibly important topic for all of our businesses in DC and particularly for many of our retail businesses. And so we are so happy to have Christine Colomani and Alex Stepik here to talk today about these issues. We're going to turn it right over to Christine and dive right into our content.
Thanks, Kate. And for everybody that's tuned in, we're going to go through some information, some strategies, some tips, and then we will be happy to address questions. So one of the first steps when we're going through questions about COVID-19 in your lease. Unfortunately, lease issues are near universal. We want to help make sure that you understand your lease. To be able to do that, you have to think about, do you have a copy of the lease? Do you have it saved electronically? Is it filed somewhere? Do you have a paper copy? Are you missing pages? Have you read what your lease says? You know, really kind of in the weeds and the details. And what does the lease say? Of course, every single word is probably not going to be important for the purposes of having trouble making payments or holding up to obligations as a result of COVID. In order to figure out how to move forward and what things should look like, how to negotiate, what type of relief you may be able to get, there are some parts of your lease that are really key that you want to look at. First is, who are the parties in the lease? Generally, this is one of the very first or the first paragraphs at the beginning. It will say the name of the landlord, and then generally in quotes afterwards, landlord. It's important that you know who your landlord is. Is it an individual? Is it another business? You also want to understand who the party that is the tenant is. Is that your business? For example, if you have an LLC or a corporation, is that the party that's the tenant in your lease? Or is it one of the owners individually? Does it have your specific name? It's very, very important to understand that, because if one of the owners individually is the tenant, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but some complications may arise. But there are also potential benefits. So you want to understand, is it the business or is it you individually? And this may impact, how some money for relief can be spent. Who is the tenant? So we want to understand, who are the parties? You can also generally go to the very end of your lease where you sign and see who are the parties. So for example, it would say, Joe Smith, owner, Joe Smith LLC. And it makes clear, Joe Smith LLC is the party. We also want to check and see if there's what's called a personal guarantee. A personal guarantee is generally going to be towards the end of the lease, or it may be an exhibit, an addendum, something that goes at the end that's referenced throughout the lease. And a personal guarantee means that the individual signing is promising that if the tenant, generally your business, doesn't hold up to their obligations in the lease, they can't pay, that this individual guarantor will make the payments and will uphold the obligations. It's similar to co-signers. So a co-signer on a loan or for an apartment for your rent. It's very important to know if you have a personal guarantee on your loan. For most folks, the guarantor will probably be at least one of the owners. And we want to understand if there's a personal guarantee or not, because in the event that you're trying to come to some type of an agreement with your landlord or renegotiate your lease, we want to understand what is on the line for that guarantor, for the owner personally. If things don't go well, which unfortunately as lawyers is always kind of where we look at things. We just want to make sure that you are negotiating with that in mind, that, we want to protect you as the owner and you as the business. If you do not know if you have a personal guarantee, please check your lease immediately. In DC, almost all small businesses do, and you want to know who it is. Sometimes it might be a family member or a spouse, so check on that. Something else that's important to look for is what's called a force majeure clause. This is a clause in many contracts that talks about if an event, whether specified, like if there's a tornado or a hurricane or an act of God, an act of terrorism, one or both of the parties to the lease, the tenant and or the landlord, are relieved of some or all obligations under the lease. Most commercial leases, if there's a force majeure clause, it does not apply to the payment of rent. However, you want to check and look at your lease and see if you have one of these. And if you do, fantastic. And let's look and see, does it apply to payment of rent? You also want to check and look, what's the term of your lease? How long is your lease for? Many leases, commercial leases, are going to be 5 years, maybe 10 years. You look at the start date and when the term ends. For example, if you have a lease that ends in May 1st of 2021, in about a month and a half, there's not too much time left on your lease. That may impact your negotiation strategy and how your landlord looks at your lease. If you are on a 10-year lease that you signed at the beginning of 2020, again, it's going to impact how your landlord looks at it because they have 9 more years of a relationship with you. Look at how long the term is. On that end, look at if there are termination provisions in your lease. This means if your landlord can end your tenancy, they can say you need to get out or you are no longer a tenant. Also, if you as the tenant can get out early before the term is up. Sometimes there is a provision that says in order to terminate early, the tenant must pay 6 months worth of what the rent is at that time, or they must pay 1 year's worth of rent at that time. We want to understand in a time of trying to negotiate leases, find new spaces, sometimes entirely shut down businesses, unfortunately, what all of the options are. And termination, if that's an option for you, we want to read what the contract says. Once we know what's in your lease, let's think about what we want from the landlord. Payment plan for some rent to be forgiven. Do you want to get out of your lease early? Do you want to renegotiate the terms of your lease going forward? Is the price too expensive? You have more space than you can ever use in this new post-COVID economy that we expect. Something that everybody wants, and almost every DC commercial tenant that's going to be a small business is entitled to, is a payment plan with their landlord for rent that they can't pay during COVID. So a landlord has to offer you this. And there are specific terms and rules for these payment plans. It has to be valid for at least 1 year from the date it is signed. You cannot be required to repay and terminate the payment plan in 6 months. If you ask for it and you as the tenant want that, it is okay, but your landlord cannot require it and they can't approach you about it. Your landlord and the payment plan must offer equal payments over the at least 1 year term of the plan. For example, your landlord can't say 1 month you have to pay $1,000 of back rent. And then following month, it goes up to $2,000, and then $3,000, and then $4,000. You must be offered equal monthly payments. Similarly, no lump sum payments. Your landlord can't tell you that in order to enter into a rental payment plan, you need to pay $5,000 of back rent, or that every month you're going to pay $5,000, and then at the very end, you have to pay whatever money is left, or a $20,000 payment. Not okay. These payment plans can cover all unpaid rent due to the public health emergency. That public health emergency started in March of 2020. The public health emergency is still going. Right now in DC, it's scheduled to end at the end of this March, but the mayor does have the authority to extend it through May. So keep an eye on what's happening with that. If you have rent that you couldn't pay starting last March, that can be included in this payment plan. Landlords and you as tenants know that you might need to pay lower rent in the coming months. We're not really sure what's going to happen and what things are going to look like. These realities can be incorporated into your payment plan. It doesn't have to just do with rent over the past year. You can think in the next few months, what rent are you going to be able to pay? What rent do you need to figure out an alternative plan for? And a payment plan is one way to do that. But it's not the only way. I mentioned you can try and negotiate with your landlord about reducing the amount of your monthly rent, whether it's for the foreseeable future, and you come to some agreement about maybe the next 6 months or 12 months, or an entire lease amendment to change the amount of the rent due for the remainder of your lease. A lot of leases, rent goes up 3% a year. 3% on top of something that business is already struggling to pay is not so realistic. Something that some small businesses, particularly restaurants, have been doing and negotiating with their landlords is looking at how the monthly rent is calculated. Instead of having a flat rent of, for example, $2,000, they will say it's a percentage of sales made, or based on a percentage of the capacity that the business is running at. For example, if you have a restaurant and right now you can only operate at 25% capacity, or maybe even lower because social distancing measures, your rent would be based on that. So for example, any regulations that the district government has in place, that restaurants can only be 50%, that you can't be seated at the bar, those factors would come into how much rent you have to pay. You can also try to negotiate, depending on your space, to reduce the amount of space that you're leasing. Some businesses have a lot of space and they don't need it. And it may be designed in a way that some of it can be used for an entirely other business. Or maybe your business wants to sublease, meaning give part of your space to another small business to use. Or for the entirety of the space, if you want to assign the lease. These are going to take the permission of your landlord. Subleasing creates a relationship where there is the landlord, and then there is you, the small business, and then the other small business that you're subleasing to. There are 3 people. When you assign the lease, your small business comes out of play. There's only the relationship between the landlord and the small business you assign to. You're giving them all of your rights and all of your obligations. This means that your business has nothing to do with the space anymore. That's an option. Early lease termination. It may be getting out as soon as possible, or it may be getting out in a year. If you have 7 more years on your lease and you think you can maybe continue going, but you are going to wrap up business soon because the economy has changed, get out of your lease early. It's sad to think about, but it's an option. Also, something that's being incorporated into a lot of rental payment plans is what's called abatement or forgiveness of some or all of the rent that you haven't been able to pay during the pandemic. Whether it's a certain dollar amount looking back that you haven't been able to pay, or certain dollar amounts that you know you won't be able to pay for the coming months. Your landlord can forgive that. You should ask for them to. Don't expect that it will be, but that's a really, really important big point to negotiate. Money you do not have to pay, and you do not worry about anyone coming after you to get you to pay. That is, in a bad situation, a good thing that can happen. You have bargaining power in trying to negotiate all of these different options. And Alex is going to share with you some of the strategies and the ways that you can negotiate, but know that while your landlord may be another small business, or it may be a huge company, they need you. I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, everybody. So my name is Alex Stepik, and I direct legal programs nationally for an organization based in New York, but operating as well in DC, supporting small business owners called Start Small, Think Big. I'll note I'm an attorney, but I'm not admitted in the District of Columbia, and I'm not anyone's attorney today, but please feel free to jump in with questions. I am seeing and advising clients from DC in the area, but also New York, California, across the country. And I think the most important thing I can tell you is that it is rough all over, but it is also similar all over. And that is a unique moment in time for small business commercial lessees. Normally, under almost every state or district's law, once you sign that lease, the things that Christine mentioned, that's tough, right? Most of those terms read in favor of the landlord. But we're at a unique moment in time where the situation more broadly is very different. So the first note here you'll see on this bullet point is that new federal programs offer you capital, and the ability to access capital is always leverage, right? There is the reinstitution of the EIDL program. There's the Paycheck Protection Program. For some of you, it hasn't opened up yet, but there's the Shuttered Venue Grant option. Those are not mandatory. You don't have to sign up for those. Some landlords I've heard will come in and be like, well, you have to go do that because you owe me under the lease, but you don't have to. And the fact that you're the one who makes that choice to go do it and what you do to spend where you're going to spend that money is a really powerful piece of leverage for a landlord that knows that in most cases they're not getting paid by almost any of their commercial tenants, and in many cases even their residential tenants if they have mixed use buildings. So you can choose or choose not to go get that money, and you can decide how much of that is going to go to settle with the landlord. Yes, you may still have obligations under the lease, but you have that opportunity. So go in knowing that that's an option to say, I can do something, but I'm going to have to go take on debt. Even if it's really good terms, that's still debt, right, under the EIDL. And even if you have the chance to convert it to a grant under the PPP, that still starts as debt. So that's leverage to say, you want me to do something, I'm willing to do it, but only if you give me something in return. That's leverage, and that's an important thing. And if you do it nicely, not like I'm not willing to do it, but if you're able to engage with that landlord who is probably suffering financially themselves right now, kindly, and say, we're trying to get on the same page, but I need you to understand that I can't just go get a whole bunch of money without risk for myself and my business. Often you're able to find some terms there where you can make these offers work better. And that's where I mentioned every single lease is fundamentally a contract, and every contract has two sides that, as Christine mentioned, often in a commercial lease are working together for years. So you have a history, you want to build more history together. That's a really sound foundation to form a team that's fighting the pandemic together, rather than two sides that are butting heads going, I want my money, and you going, I don't have it, and them saying, well, then I'm in trouble and I'm going to get angry with you, right? Instead, it's, trying to find that common ground and recognizing and pointing out that, again, under normal times, leases are often difficult to renegotiate. But these days, every smart landlord, every rational landlord, and in DC, every landlord who is compliant with the law is having to offer some kind of concessions and work through something to renegotiate that lease. And every contract is always renegotiable. Just because you signed it doesn't mean that if both parties agree to change it, you can change it. So you're going into this conversation thinking about it that way. You have some leverage that you didn't have before. The landlord is under pressure that they aren't normally under, but you're also under pressure, and maybe you can turn that into a commonality rather than a friction point. And so to that, and that's the next point, is really what you want to do when you go in there strategy-wise is try to understand where the other side is coming from, right? Like running a small business is tough. Before I've been in private practice advising lots of small businesses. I myself have had a couple of startups that I've been co-founded and been a part of. Some have been successful, some have not. And it that's painful. There's an emotional element that I want to acknowledge for everybody that's trying to figure this out and weather this storm. It is heavy. We are all hurting. But when you walk in and negotiate with someone else, the best tactic I can tell you is try to put yourself in their shoes. Try to show yourself to be an ally of their interests. And to do that, you have to start by trying to understand what they really want and what they really need. Because if you have something that they need, you have leverage, right? And in many cases right now, like I said, landlords aren't really collecting from most to all of their tenants, at least not in full. So if you have any capacity to pay, whether it's by going to raise capital or take on a loan from the government programs, or just you have some cash stored up, but it's not enough to cover back rent, you all of a sudden have a ton more leverage, because right now it's very unlikely that a landlord will easily find a new tenant. So maybe they'll say, well, I'll sue you. And you'll say, great, in 5 years, when we might be done with this litigation, you might get some of this money if it's even there. But if not, they don't have cash coming in, and many of them have lenders, right? They've taken out a mortgage to purchase that property. In many cases, they owe somebody else money from the rent that they're collecting. So really think about where they're at and try to meet them there. I know it's crazy to say, here's somebody who's demanding way too much money and trying to bully me, but I need to think about where they're coming from and really meet them emotionally there. But if you do it, I can tell you those are the moments where really good deals happen, where you break through the friction, right? I've had experiences where I was representing a party that was in litigation over hundreds of millions of dollars. And it was 45 minutes of sitting across the table and just saying, what's this really about for you? I don't want to talk about settlement. I don't want to talk about what my client gets. What do you need here? What's the issue for you? Is it that you cannot back down, or is there anything that you would rather have than this litigation, right? And we ended up settling that case, and it was massive. But the point is, the massive level that we settled it for was way below what everybody was yelling about beforehand. We were not talking about hundreds of millions of dollars anymore. It came down to whole decimal points because we just asked. So try to imagine where they're coming from, but also, it's helpful to ask, right? And think about how you present to them, right? Have you been making timely and full rent payments beforehand? Up to the pandemic, were you a good tenant? Do you have a history personally, professionally with them that you can say, this is where I'm coming to you from. I'm a good tenant. I want to stay a good tenant. Right now, I can't do everything that I want to do. Fantastic. That puts you in a really good position. And then just remember, you can't renegotiate if neither side brings it up. So it may be the case that they owe you a payment plan, but they may just sit down and write up a payment plan that they like. And if you have other things like Christine was talking about, and more of the stuff we'll talk about in a minute, that you really want to get in there, and if you're saying a 1-year payment plan just isn't going to do it, rather than waiting for the other side to start the conversation, you can take that, say, I want to come to you to get something that works, that gets you as much of your money as is going to be possible, but also does it in a fashion that really works for me, because you're going to get less money if you push hard here. If you put the screws to me, you apply pressure, I'm going to do what I'm legally mandated to do at a minimum, but I may not be able to get the business rolling. And if we have a 15-year lease, wouldn't you rather we get back to me paying something like pre-pandemic rent as soon as possible? Because the other thing I'm going to share with you is nationally, the commercial real estate market has dropped by 20 to 30 points, even in high value commercial areas, right? So that means that even if they had someone lined up to take the space, it is very unlikely that the landlord is going to get the same amount of rent for several years that you signed on to pre-pandemic. That is a really valuable negotiating tactic to say, we need a payment plan. We may even need a long-term reduction, but as long as that reduction works out for the landlord to be less than 30%, then the math should work out in their favor. Now, not every landlord is open to hearing that. Not every landlord is living in reality. You know, it's tough. It's a very hard time, and many people put all of their money into these buildings, and they can't accept that that's the state of affairs. But that's the economy as we see it, right? For the next 2 years at least, we expect no one to be signing leases for more than 20 or 30% below what pre-pandemic levels were. That fact alone, I've seen, has brought a lot of landlords to the table to say, great. So this is just math now. This isn't about you don't want to pay me. It's just you can't pay me and I'm not going to get it better elsewhere. What is the middle ground that we have that we can work together? So those are the strategies that we take, is make sure you're thinking about asking. Before you even go in and ask, make sure you have your numbers aligned so that you're not just thinking, how can I squeeze them? You're actually asking yourself, really, how much can I afford? And what do they need? What do they need from me? How much can they afford to take a hit on this? And going in and saying, this is renegotiable. Let's sit down and talk about this. I'll also point out one last tactic that's really valuable is normally in an initial negotiation, you may not want to be super forthcoming, super candid, super into sharing about sort of what your financials are. In this context, it has been very effective to be candid with your landlord. You can say, please keep this in confidence. These are very personal numbers about my business and how we're doing. But people are much more successful when they're willing to share some of those actual profit and loss, not the numbers for landlords, because a lot of landlords are saying things like, well, you've been, say, a restaurant, you've been serving people takeout, like how bad can it really be? Like maybe you've suffered 20% decline. And then when they see the numbers, it might be, no, we're doing 20% of our prior revenue and have no profit margin whatsoever. We're losing money trying to stay in business so that we don't lose our customer base, so that we don't lose our trained employees. Like some landlords are seeing minimal levels of activity and up and down and shutdowns come and go and different industries are allowed to open. And they're thinking, well, you must be getting back to it. But actually being willing to share not just sort of a real sense of what the revenue looks like, but the profit and when you expect you might be profitable again, helps them to understand that there isn't money there, right? That what you're offering is a legitimate offer. So those are some options that you can get into. And obviously through Start Small and our partnership with the DC Bar, there's opportunity when you actually dig into those negotiations to get a little bit more specific and most importantly, to make sure you have it in writing. You know, I've also heard landlords say, especially early in the pandemic, they said things, and now we have clients coming to us going, 6 months ago, I agreed to this. I'd really like the landlord to extend it, but now they're saying, no, I didn't agree to forgive 6 months of rent. I agreed to let you pay me back later. And now I want it all plus paying the same rent. And they're going, we're still in the same spot. I can't do it. And some of that is not getting on the same page fully with the landlord. Sometimes it's just that some people are shady. Get it in writing, right? It doesn't have to be a formal document that completely replaces the lease every time, but you do need something in writing that you can come back to and say, this was agreed by both parties. And that goes back to Christine, who I'll hand it back to, which is, this is another thing in your lease. You need to ask, how can a lease be changed? It's usually in the lease itself, and it usually says agreed to in writing by both parties. And so sometimes the agreement can be an email saying, yes, I agree. Sometimes it says signed. So you need to see what actually will be a binding amendment to your lease as you go forward. And of course, reach out. DC Bar, Start Small, Think Big. If you want to talk about more tactics, if you want to dig in on how to approach the landlord, we're here to help.
Thanks, Alex. So, we've talked about understanding your lease and what steps you can take to negotiate. But what do things look like in DC, right? I mentioned that by law, commercial landlords are going to be required to offer you a payment plan. That's not the only thing going on in DC right now, or in general. First of all, if your landlord wants to evict you, they must file a case in DC Superior Court. They must file a case. Self-help evictions are illegal. They can't change the locks. Put up a fence so you can't get to your space. They can't turn off the utilities. They can't make it so hostile or move somebody else in. Remove your business's property. They cannot do that. They must file in DC Superior Court to evict you. Right now in DC, there is a moratorium on filing eviction cases. In addition, you cannot be charged late fees for rent that you do not pay or do not pay in full during the public health emergency. Actual evictions can't be carried out during the public health emergency. There is a moratorium on evictions. We did get a question that there was a court case in DC that, and there was a ruling that the eviction moratorium is unconstitutional. That order is being appealed, and there is what's called a stay. And that means that it's on pause until there is a decision on the appeal or some movement. You still cannot be evicted. And remember, in order for you to be evicted, your landlord must file a case in DC Superior Court first. So you will know that it's coming and if it's allowed to happen. Something that's really important to note is that if maybe you do get evicted or your landlord files a case against you in DC Superior Court, again, you want to go back to your lease and look at who the parties are. If the tenant party, your business, is a corporate entity, meaning an LLC, a partnership, a corporation, in court, if your landlord sues you, you have to be represented by an attorney. You can't represent yourself. So this is where looking and thinking back to what's in your lease and understanding it comes into play. Also, you want to make sure that your landlord, if they file a case in Superior Court, is suing the right party. If the landlord tries to sue you as an owner of a business or the operator of a business, but the lease is under the business entity and you haven't personally guaranteed the lease, you want to know that. And again, we talked about in DC only, landlords must offer payment plans. On top of some of these, difficulties, there is financial relief out there. There is money. It may not be money that can go all to rent, but it can help offset other costs, or you can spend a certain amount on your rent. Alex mentioned PPP, that's an option. Right now it's open until March 31st. There is movement to extend it through the end of May, but if you're interested in another PPP loan, start now. Some lenders are already closing it for the March 31st deadline. So we want to make sure that if you need that money, if you're eligible for that money, you can get it. Again, the economic injury disaster loan. And the SBA is actually reaching out to some small businesses for a targeted economic injury disaster loan advance grant. That's a grant of $1,000 per employee of your business up to $10,000. The DC government has different grants. There are many private grants for small businesses right now, whether it's certain industries, certain ownership, and your main streets. If you are located on a main street corridor in DC, check, read your emails, get in touch with the executive director or the staff and see, do they have a grant right now? Can it help you with rent? Can it help you with marketing and advertising to increase your revenue? What's the application process look like? Oh, you missed one that just happened. Are they going to have another round? there is some money to help you out there, whether, like Alex mentioned, it's taking out loans, whether it's grants. The reality is that, you know, you wouldn't be doing this otherwise, but you may need to right now. And before we get to kind of questions and overview, unfortunately, the reality is that some small businesses, after all of this, and after every effort to negotiate with your landlord and seek financial relief, will have cases filed against you in DC Superior Court. And there may be a judgment against your business. That's nothing to be ashamed of. And I know Alex also has thoughts on this. Being evicted, you know, some not great things happening with the business, it happens all the time in the best of circumstances. Unfortunately, it's a risk you take. But in these economic circumstances, believe me, it is going to happen to probably more businesses than we want to think about. You know, the most, you know, ideal, perfectly thought of, everything was so together business. And this is, again, coming back to understanding your lease. If your lease, the tenant party, is your business, and there is no personal guarantee, any judgment against your business for not paying rent or for rent that was going to be due before you broke the lease, after you broke the lease, that will only come out of what's held in the business entity, your LLC. One of the big reasons the business owners, you create an LLC or a corporation is to separate the business assets from the owner's assets. And so understanding and remembering that, you structured your business in a certain way for certain reasons, for worst case scenarios. This could be a worst case scenario. It is okay. And there are huge corporations, huge LLCs that use having a corporate entity intentionally to get out of having to pay money. The fact that your business is using or may use a business entity because there was a really crazy global pandemic that was completely out of your control that impacted your business, not shameful, not bad. It is reality. And it doesn't mean that you can't go and start another business. It is not the end of the road. I don't know if you want to add to that, Alex.
I want to add, I mentioned briefly, I've had my own startups, and I'll tell you that I had at least one after a year and a half of careful work go down in flames. This is not related to the pandemic. This was related to our own business choices. I'm not happy that that happened in my life in the general sense. I would have been happier had it succeeded, but I'm not ashamed of the fact, and I'm here sharing that, you know, that happened. We wasted a ton of time and money, and it didn't work. And other things have worked better that I've run or started before. And entrepreneurship is a journey. It's a process, and some of the most important steps in that process are recognizing when the losses are only going to continue to mount, when the hole is too deep, and finding a healthy way to pivot, to look to the next thing, to move on. So I can say 100% I agree with you, Christine, and I want to say that to everyone here. Sometimes it's not about trying to grind it out. Sometimes it's about finding the best of bad alternatives so that you can build something great again. If you were successfully running a business, building a business before the pandemic, you have the skill set and the capacity to do it again. But you may hang an anchor around your neck if you fight to save that particular version of the business. The economy is changing. The way we do business is changing. You know, use legal services, use lawyers, use the support services that you get from, you know, one of the best small business support networks I've seen anywhere in the country, in DC, to pivot, to adjust, and to think about what the next steps are for you. And if it is in this brick and mortar space with this landlord, hopefully it's because they're rational and they're open to negotiating, and you can find a way forward that works for both sides.
Absolutely. And as Alex mentioned, there are so many resources available to you. If some of the resources that you need are legal assistance, having an attorney look through the lease with you to help you understand what it says, what it means, or look over a lease amendment before you sign it. Ideally, you want a lawyer to look at something before you sign it. The contact information for the Pro Bono Center and Start Small, Think Big are on the screen, and they'll be in a copy of the slides. And I know that they're also in the chat. Reach out. We want to help you. We are all working together to make this, the best of a really bad situation, and help you have good strategies and good outcomes. I do see a couple of questions.
And Christine, I just posted all the questions that we've gotten so far in one thread, that last piece that I just put in, if you want to read through them directly there.
Perfect. Okay. So the payment plans related to COVID-19 and unpaid rent are DC law. So that only applies for commercial properties that are located in the district. If you also have a location in Maryland or Virginia of your small business, the payment plan law does not apply. I talked a bit about DC's eviction moratorium. So right now, you cannot be evicted in DC. And remember, in order to be evicted, you have to go through the court process. So it's not something that is just going to happen overnight. And if it does, if your landlord is threatening that, or you show up and they've changed the locks, get in touch with us. That is not okay. That is absolutely illegal. Okay, so for some small businesses, you generally, when it comes to your lease, work with property management. There's somebody that handles, all of the different properties that your landlord owns. And if you're having trouble getting in touch with the property management company, and you haven't been able to get in touch with the owner, there's not always a good solution there. Oftentimes, the owner will give all of their rights to the property management company to communicate and work with you. If the management company is not willing to offer you a payment plan after you have let them know that you're unable to meet your rent obligations as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, you can, first of all, let them know that the law requires them to offer you one. And second, you can file a complaint with the DCRA, the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. Can you put cameras outside of your rental property? So that is going to depend on, first of all, what your lease says about modifications to the property. Sometimes lessees, you as the tenant, in order to make substantial changes, have to get the approval of your landlord. And sometimes you may only be able to make changes to the interior, the inside of your building, and anything outside, including signs for your business or lights, do have to be approved. So you're going to want to check your lease, and it's going to depend on what your lease says, and also what type of space you rent. Are you renting a standalone building? Are you a storefront on the bottom floor of a building that has other things next to you and apartments above? Are you one office in a big office building? So all of those are going to come into play. In terms of grants, for the DC government, if you go to coronavirus.dc.gov, and Kate also put the link in the chat, there is information on so many of the different resources. Unfortunately, with private grants, though, they're changing. It's going to take some Googling. Again, if you're located in a Main Street corridor or a bid, talk with the executive director about if they're keeping a resource list. Other small business technical assistance providers, business counselors, if they're keeping a list of what grants. But unfortunately, it takes a little bit of legwork to figure out what private grants are out there. Some of them may be specific to DC or DC region. Some may be nationwide. Some may be specific to using the money in one way or to solving one's kind of problem. So you want to see what's out there and if it can help you. When you're looking to sign a new lease, before you sign it, please, please, please have an attorney review it. There's no 100% rule about, this is what can or cannot be in a lease. It's going to depend on the circumstances of you and your business, the space, and the landlord. However, if you have a business entity, you have an LLC, you have a corporation, you have a limited partnership, make sure that that business entity, the business itself, is the party to the lease, is the tenant, and not you individually as the owner. Please make sure of that. And if your landlord insists on a personal guarantee, which many do in DC, try to negotiate again with them to guarantee a certain amount of the lease. For example, if at the end there is $50,000 of unpaid rent, they can only come after you as the guarantor for 20% of that, $10,000, or 50% of that, $25,000. Limit the percentage that you're willing to guarantee. It may not work out, but again, it's worth a shot. If you're signing a new commercial lease in 10 years, that advice might not work anymore. But right now, and for the foreseeable future, that is it. But please come to us, have somebody review it before you sign it. So again, looking back to evictions, if there is a judgment for possession against your business or you in Superior Court, and the judge says that you have to give up possession to the landlord, at that point, they still can't just go change the locks. It is a formal process. Okay, and I think that is it for written questions. You can keep sending them in if you have more. And I think for those that are on the phone, if you have questions, we'll give you an opportunity in a second.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry if there's some background noise where I am. I'm going to unmute the call-in users. If there's a lot of background noise, we will remute you and then go one by one, but we're just going to unmute the first couple. So the 202 numbers, we're sending you a request to unmute if you do have questions that you'd like to ask right now. Everyone with a 202 number has been given a request to unmute. So we haven't heard anything from our 202 numbers. We also do our 301 and 703 numbers. You've also been sent a request to unmute. For those of you who are on the phone, if you do not have a question now, or if you're unable to unmute and ask it, we will also share all of the slides and the PowerPoint chat from this, so you'll be able to follow up with our speakers afterwards as well.
Okay, that's what I was asking, ma'am, because I can't see the address and the telephone numbers of how to contact you.
If you registered for this event, you will receive an email from us. It'll take a little bit because the recording has to finish processing, but you should see that today or tomorrow morning at the latest. If for some reason you do not see that information or need to follow up on something, you can also contact my team at innO.ed@dc.gov. Again, that is innO.ed@dc.gov.
INNO.ed
At dc.gov.
at dc.gov. And just let me quickly say thank you so very much for this time with you and the different topics that you have shared with us. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much. I think another call-in user has unmuted, so if you had a question, please feel free.
Hi, yes.
My question is there any limit to, let's say, for example, you own the landlord $100,000. Does DC have any statutes or limitations on how much they can get from that money, or do you have to pay them the $100,000?
So the amount of money that you would have to pay them, I mean, theoretically, it's $100,000. But in order for them to recover that money, if you chose not to pay or were unable to pay, would depend on the judgment by the court. So you would go to the court, they would file a case against you, they would provide evidence, the judge would look at the circumstances, and then they would decide how much money there was that's owed. And in addition, your business might owe $100,000. But if your business only has $20,000 in assets, your business liquidates the bank account, does everything it can, shuts down, sells everything. If there's only $20,000 there, you can't pay $100,000. It's impossible. Sometimes that's where personal guarantees are going to come in. If there's a personal guarantee, you personally may be responsible for the entire $100,000 or the remaining $80,000. So, your car, your home, your bank account, your personal assets. That's why we really want to understand what's in your lease, who's responsible, who the parties are, and try to avoid a situation where you're being forced to pay the entire amount of money due. So negotiating now.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my question is, who on this webinar would we contact if we wanted help reviewing the lease that we have and getting help negotiating with the landlord the terms of the lease under this pandemic?
So you can contact Start Small, Think Big or the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, and you'll be doing it online. So if you go to our websites that are in the slides, in the chat, and on the screen, you'll fill out a form, and then we will get in touch with you to set you up to chat with an attorney.
Okay, thank you so much.
Absolutely. And if, for some reason things aren't working, you have questions, email addresses are also on the screen. My name is Christine Kulumani, CKULUMANI @dcbar.org is my email address. I can put it in the chat also. You are free to send me an email if something urgent comes up, right? For example, your landlord is trying to force you to sign something immediately or threatening to kick you out. Kind of worst case scenarios, you can reach out to me directly.
So I know we are pretty much at time. We do have some great contact information for folks to be able to follow up with our speakers today. We will be sharing the recording, the materials, and the chat to everyone who is registered, and even we'll be sharing this video broadly and beyond folks who had not registered. I want to take this moment to thank Christine and Alex for a very helpful, a very timely, and a very important presentation. We really appreciate this, both the presentation and all of the things that you are doing every day to support small businesses here and across the country. And I'll just give it, if there's any last pieces that you did want to close with, please feel free, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you all for joining. Please, if you need help, reach out to Start Small, Think Big or the Pro Bono Center, and we work together for legal help, looking over things, and try, as Alex mentioned, to negotiate with your landlord. If you don't ask, they aren't going to offer you things, probably. So it's worth asking these questions. Can you forgive my rent? Can we negotiate? What do you need?
Yep, I would just second everything Christine said and note, we've seen a lot of landlords who have agreed to very generous terms with people, but they've asked for confidentiality clauses. So you may even be next door to someone in the same building and think, the landlord's not negotiating, and they may have just negotiated a huge cut and rent forgiveness with the person next door, but they didn't want to bring it up with everybody else. So as Christine says, if you don't ask, you won't ever find out if they're open to it. And a lot of landlords are, even though they don't want to publicize it. So keep plugging away. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. They drive over 50% of the employment in most urban areas. It's huge, and we're here to help. And also, I'll note that Start Small also offers financial management assistance. So there may be times where you're trying to figure out what you can afford to pay, trying to run numbers, and that's a service that our organization offers as well that can then pair you with the DC Bar support on the legal side. So don't hesitate to reach out for help. That's the most important thing. Running a business is hard. You're not supposed to be an expert at every part of it, and so we're here to offer everything we can to support you.
I have a question before we can close. I apologize. This just ran through my head. Would the court still evict a business even though they are not open during this difficult time? Would they still force for you to evict the premises if you're not in operation and because it's closed down based on the fact that there's no businesses? I'm not so sure.
So in theory, yes, even if your business is shut, you're operating the business from home, but you still have that commercial location and you have the lease. If you go through the court process and the judge determines that you have violated your lease and the landlord asks for eviction, and there is no eviction moratorium at DC at the time, you can be evicted. Just because you're not actively using the space, if you're legally responsible for paying rent and are storing your things there, you can be evicted, theoretically.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're going to stop the recording and say thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for your team.